Let me tell you a story. Let us now turn to the antebellum American science scene and to a native son of the city of brotherly love. At age 17, this young man began attending lectures at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, and he went on to earn his first medical degree from that school in 1820. And shortly thereafter, this young man became a member of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia. And in 1824, he began his medical practice in Philadelphia, and it wasn't too long before he became a rising star in the local medical community, eventually joining the Pennsylvania Medical College in Philadelphia as a professor of anatomy. And in 1830, this young professor was preparing a lecture titled "The Different Forms of the Skull as Exhibited in the Five Races of Men." The different forms of the skull as exhibited in the five races of men. That was his lecture topic, which was a throwback to the work of German anatomist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. Well, our young professor realized while prepping this lecture that he really didn't have enough illustrations of skulls to thoroughly exemplify each group he wanted to discuss. And thus began his lifelong quest to acquire as many human skulls from all across the planet as he possibly could. This man's name was Samuel George Morton. And in the year 1839, in pre-Civil War America, Samuel George Morton published a book called Crania Americana, also known as A Comparative View of the Skulls of Various Aboriginal Nations of North and South America. This book was largely a study of Native American or American Indian skulls. And this work was widely praised as revolutionary, in large part because of the 71 beautiful, in fact, quite stunning lithograph illustrations contained in the book. So for the first time, the world could actually see in minute detail the unique characteristics of human skull formations from a vast array of skull samples that Samuel George Morton had by that time begun to collect from people all over the world. Now, Crania Americana is also significant because Samuel George Morton continued the classification system begun by Johann Friedrich Blumenbach of ranking the human races by cranial capacity. And in Morton's work, in descending order of human skull volume, he prioritized Caucasians first, Mongolians second, Malaysians third, Native Americans fourth, and Negroes fifth. Samuel George Morton noted the Caucasian race. These are his notes on the Caucasian race. Quote, distinguished by the facility with which it attains the highest intellectual endowments, end quote. Morton noted of Native Americans, quote, averse to cultivation and slow in acquiring knowledge, restless, revengeful, and fond of war, and wholly destitute of maritime adventure, end quote. Of the Ethiopians or Negroes, Morton wrote, quote, is joyous, flexible, and indolent, meaning lazy, while the many nations which compose this race present a singular diversity of intellectual character, of which the far extreme is the lowest grade of humanity, end quote. So that was Samuel George Morton's first work on his craniological research, Crania Americana. Now, his second work, based upon his craniological research, was called Crania Aegyptiaca. Crania Aegyptiaca. That's the archaic spelling of Egypt. And this book was also known as Observations on Egyptian Ethnography Derived from Anatomy, History, and the Monuments. Observations on Egyptian Ethnography Derived from Anatomy, History, and the Monuments. But its most popular name was Crania Aegyptiaca. And this second book was published in 1844. And in this study, Samuel George Morton sought to prove that the distinct racial differences shown in modern Caucasoid, meaning European white folks, and Negroid, meaning African black folks, that their crania, their skulls, those differences were equally as present and as obvious in antiquity as well as they are in modern day society. So in other words, European white folks have always been superior to African black folks based upon the size, the overall volume of their human skull formations. And so Morton's conclusion in his book Crania Aegyptiaca was that the ruling, now just sit down, brothers and sisters, and take a big deep breath for this one. So Morton's conclusion in his book Crania Aegyptiaca was that the ruling elite of ancient Egypt had been Caucasian, while the subservient class had been Negroid. So just let that sink in. And I will say here, just to take it off script for a minute, I will say this. That's true, depending upon what time in history you look. When the Greeks came in 325 BC or so and took over Egypt, it was at its decline. It was in the 25th 28th dynasty by that point. So you would have white folks from Greece at 325. And after that, you would have Italians on the thrones and running Egypt closer toward Christ. So that is true if you go to 325 BC. Now, when you start creeping back into 1000 BC and 2000 BC and 3000 BC, just remember this, brothers and sisters. Just remember this when you study human history. The farther back you go, the blacker it gets. Okay? The farther back you go, the blacker it gets. These scientific claims coming from Samuel George Morton, this was all that his contemporary American and European colleagues, this is all they needed to continue justifying and defending the horrific practice of American chattel slavery that was ever present at that time in our history in this country. So Morton's belief, and it is important here to underscore that by this time, he had become a prominent physician and a very well-respected natural scientist. Samuel George Morton's belief that enslavement of blacks by whites had roots in antiquity. This belief system fueled a larger political argument for a natural order of racial hierarchy. That's important. And I will wrap this all up, brothers and sisters, with this little bow right here. When Samuel George Morton died in 1851, at age 52, the Charleston, South Carolina Medical Journal published a memoir. And here's what they said, quote, "We can only say that we of the South should consider him as our benefactor for aiding most materially in giving to the Negro his true position as an inferior race," end quote. We can only say that we of the South should consider him as our benefactor for aiding most materially in giving to the Negro his true position as an inferior race. We have been digging up the historical roots of race as we perceive it today, and racism as we experience it in this contemporary matrix. And brothers and sisters, the work of Samuel George Morton is yet another deep historical root of racism. By virtue of the huge collection of human skulls in his possession, which far exceeded the number that Johann Friedrich Blumenbach had studied. And because Morton was able to so beautifully illustrate his skulls using the, at that time, newly developed technique of lithography, Samuel George Morton was able to take the breadth and scope of Blumenbach's cranial research to a whole other level. And what is also significant about Samuel George Morton is that he was not European born. He was not. He was an American from Philadelphia. And to this very day, Samuel George Morton is often thought of as the originator of American school ethnography. Ethnography being that school of thought in antebellum, meaning pre-Civil War American science, that claimed the difference between humans was one of species, polygenism. And to this very day, Samuel George Morton is seen by some as one of the American originators, if not the American originator of scientific racism. Scientific racism. Now, the last time we were together, we pulled up another deep root of racism in discussing the work of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who was, as I've laid out here, a bit of a mentor to, and certainly had an influence on Mr. Samuel George Morton. And before that, we discussed the work of Mr. Carl Linnaeus, who was the first of the Age of Enlightenment philosophers to describe human beings just as he described any other plant or animal. And Carl Linnaeus went on to subdivide the human species into 4 varieties based on continent and skin color. And as we talked about later detailed what he saw as the stereotypical characteristics for each of those four varieties of the human species of man. So to recap, brothers and sisters, we have so far traced our deep historical roots of racism to two Europeans, Karl Linnaeus and Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, and today we add one American, Samuel George Morton.